The cold was the first thing they gave her. It was a gift from the village, delivered in the thinness of the sacrificial tunic, in the damp air that clung to the stone altar, in the frosted iron manacles that bit into her wrists. Ilara had known this cold her whole life, but never like this. This was a final cold, a cold with teeth. They'd called it an honor, a sacred duty, one life to appease the beast of the petrified peaks, to buy another year of meager harvests and grudging survival for the rest of them. The lottery was a formality. Her name had been the only one in the bowl. Ilara, the girl with the twisted leg, the one who was already broken. A flawed offering for a monster. It felt fitting. She shivered, the motion sending a sharp, familiar pain up her thigh from the poorly set bone. She was used to pain. It was a constant companion, a dull thrum beneath the surface of her days. But fear was a different animal. It was a living thing, coiling in her belly, slick and cold as a serpent. The woods around the altar were silent, not the gentle silence of a sleeping forest, but a dead, waiting silence. The trees were skeletal, their branches like claws of gray stone reaching for a perpetually overcast sky. Nothing grew here. No moss, no fungus, not even a weed. The beast's curse tainted the very soil. Hours passed, the sky bruised from gray to a deep, starless purple. Every snap of a twig in the distant living woods made her flinch. Her imagination painted 1,000 different ends for herself, each more gruesome than the last. Claws like sickles, teeth like daggers. A guttural roar that would be the last thing she ever heard. She thought of her father, his face a mask of grim duty as he'd led her here. She thought of the other villagers, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and raw, naked relief. Better her than me. That was the truth of it. She was a splinter to be pulled, a festering wound to be cauterized. Her worthlessness was a cloak she'd worn for so long it felt like her own skin. The limp, the way she couldn't help with the heavy work, the quiet way she took up space. It all added up to this, an offering, a thing to be discarded. A sound finally broke the oppressive quiet. Not a roar, it was heavier. A footstep like a falling boulder, then another. It was slow, deliberate, the sound of immense weight moving with impossible stealth. It came from the deepest shadows between the petrified trees. Ilara squeezed her eyes shut. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. This was it. The beast was here. She recited the names of the winter stars, a little girl's charm against the dark, her voice a choked whisper lost in the cold. A scent reached her first, pine and frozen earth and something else. Something wild and musky and ancient. It was the smell of power. She felt a pressure in the air, a weight that had nothing to do with gravity. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, centered on the approaching presence. She forced her eyes open. It was bigger than she could have imagined. A creature of nightmare and shadow, it stood on 2 legs but was stooped, its massive shoulders bunched with muscle that shifted under a pelt of midnight black fur. Its head was wolf-like, but larger, more intelligent, with a jaw that could snap a tree trunk. And its eyes glowed with a faint internal light, the color of a winter moon. It took another step, and another, its gaze locked on her. It wasn't moving like a mindless animal. It was studying her, assessing, the predator before the kill. Ilara couldn't scream. The sound was frozen in her throat. All she could do was stare, her life narrowing to this single, terrifying point in time. The beast stopped a few feet from the altar, its sheer size blocking out what little light remained in the sky. It was a mountain of fur and fury, and she was a broken doll at its feet. It lowered its great head, its snout sniffing the air around her. A low sound rumbled in its chest, a vibration she felt in her own bones. It wasn't a growl of aggression. It was something else. Confusion? She could feel its breath, surprisingly not hot, but cold, like the air from a deep cave. It smelled the thin tunic, the iron of the manacles, the fear clinging to her like a second skin. Its glowing eyes narrowed. Then, something impossible happened. The creature's form began to waver, to shimmer like heat haze on a summer road. The air cracked and popped. Bones shifted with sounds like grinding stones. The black fur receded, melting back into skin. The wolfish snout shortened, the massive shoulders narrowed, the entire form contracting, reshaping itself. Ilara stared, her terror momentarily forgotten, replaced by a profound, heart-stopping awe. Where the monster had stood, a man now knelt. He was tall, even on one knee, with broad shoulders draped in dark, simple leathers. His hair was black as a raven's wing, long and unbound, falling around a face that was harsh and beautiful. It was a face carved from granite and sorrow, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. His skin was pale, unnaturally so, as if he hadn't seen the sun in a century. And his eyes, still holding that faint pale glow, were fixed on her with an expression of utter, world-shattering disbelief. He reached out a hand, his fingers long and calloused. She flinched, expecting a blow, a killing strike, but his touch was shockingly gentle as he brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. His skin was cold, so incredibly cold, colder than the manacles, colder than the stone. He knelt before her, the beast of the peaks, the monster from the stories. He looked at her not as a meal, but as a miracle. A single word left his lips, his voice a low, rough thing, like stones grinding in a deep riverbed. Chi-Yu. He took her to his castle. Not dragged, not forced, but carried. He had shattered her manacles with a single, contemptuous twist of his hands, the frozen iron exploding like glass. Then, before she could even process it, he had scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing. The journey was a blur of motion and biting wind. He moved through the petrified forest with a liquid grace that belied his size. Ilara was pressed against his chest, her face buried in the cold leather of his tunic. He was a wall of solid, unyielding muscle, but there was no warmth to him. It was like being held by a statue. The castle rose from the mountainside like a shard of black ice. It was a grim, forbidding place of sharp towers and narrow windows, the stone itself seeming to drink the light from the sky. A permanent layer of frost clung to every surface, sparkling with a cruel, diamond-like beauty. Inside, it was no warmer. The great halls were vast and silent, their floors polished black stone, their ceilings lost in shadow. Torches burned in iron sconces along the walls, but their flames gave off no heat, only a cold, blue-white light that did nothing to chase away the chill. The air was still and dead. It was a tomb. He set her down in a chamber that was clearly meant to be luxurious. A huge bed with a carved headboard dominated one wall, piled high with black furs. A fireplace stood cold and empty, its stone mouth gaping like a silent scream. He didn't speak, just watched her as she took it all in, her bad leg throbbing from the sudden journey. "Why?" she finally whispered, the word barely a puff of white in the frigid air. It was the only question she had. Why save her? Why kneel? Why bring her here? He turned his pale eyes on her. "For centuries, my line has been bound to this cold," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast room. "A curse, laid by an ancient enemy. It leeches the warmth from everything. The land, my home, me." He held up a hand. The skin was pale, threaded with blue veins, like a map of a frozen river system. "I have not felt warmth in over 200 years. Ilara stared at him, trying to comprehend the scale of what he was saying. 200 years of this bone-deep cold. Sacrifices, he continued, a note of disgust in his tone. Your people are fools. They think a blood offering will appease a force of nature. It does nothing. It has never done anything. I have ignored their pathetic ritual for decades. Then why? She started, her voice trembling. Why did you come for me? Because I felt something, he said, his gaze intense, pinning her in place. For the first time since the curse took hold, I felt a change in the wind, a flicker, like a candle being lit 100 miles away. It was you. He took a step closer. She instinctively shuffled back, her hand going to the ache in her leg. You are not a sacrifice, he stated the words absolute. You are the cure. The declaration hung in the air between them, heavy and unbelievable. Her? The broken girl? A cure for an ancient curse? It was madness. She was nothing. A cast-off. I don't understand, she said, shaking her head. I have nothing. I am nothing. You are wrong, he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. There is a heat inside you, a fire I haven't felt in an eternity. I don't know its source, but your very presence pushes back the frost. When I knelt before you at that altar, the stone beneath my knees was warm. He gestured around the cold, dead room. This place, it is a little less cold, simply because you are in it. She looked down at her hands, half expecting to see them glowing. They were just her hands. Thin, chapped, ordinary. There was no fire. There was nothing special about her. He had to be mistaken. You will stay here, he commanded, though it was spoken gently. You will want for nothing. Food, clothes, books, anything you desire. All I ask is that you remain. Your presence is all I need. It was an arrangement, a bargain. She was not a guest, not a prisoner, but a tool. A living furnace to warm his frozen world. It was a better fate than being torn apart on an altar, but a cold knot of disappointment formed in her chest. Of course, he didn't see her. He saw a solution to his problem. It was just a different kind of usefulness. My name is Alara, she said quietly, a small act of defiance. She would not be a nameless cure. For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed his harsh features. I am Kalen, he replied. And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the vast cold chamber, the weight of his impossible words settling over her like a shroud of snow. Days bled into one another in the silent castle. Kalen was true to his word. Food appeared outside her door on silver trays, hot and steaming, though it cooled within minutes in the frigid air. Gowns of velvet and wool, dyed in rich colors of crimson and emerald, were laid out on her bed, a stark contrast to the monochrome world outside. She explored the castle. It was a labyrinth of frozen corridors and echoing halls. Every surface was slick with a thin layer of ice. The tapestries on the walls were stiff with frost, their vibrant scenes of battle and celebration muted into shades of gray. It was a place held in a perpetual state of dying, preserved at the moment of its last breath. Yet Kalen was right. Where she walked, the ice seemed to recede, just a little. The air in a room she occupied for a few hours would lose its sharpest bite. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible change, but it was there. She was a tiny ember in an endless winter. She found the library. It was a circular room, 2 stories high, its shelves packed with thousands of books. Here, the cold felt older, deeper. The leather bindings of the books were cracked and brittle. She ran a finger over a spine, and a fine powder of ice dusted her skin. But she stayed. She found a thick fur rug, dragged it to the center of the room, and began to read. She read tales of the old world, of summer kingdoms and sun-warmed seas. She read histories of Kalen's line, of the Sun Kings who ruled before the curse, their banners emblazoned with a golden starburst. She read about the witch, Morwen, the sea hag who had loved Kalen's ancestor and had been scorned, her rage turning an entire kingdom to ice. Kalen himself was a ghost. She would go days without seeing him. Then, she would catch a glimpse of him at the end of a long corridor, a tall, dark figure watching her before melting back into the shadows. He never approached, never spoke. One night, she awoke with a gasp. A nightmare, formless and terrifying, had her heart racing. The room was colder than usual, the chill seeping deep into her bones. She sat up, pulling the furs tighter around her shoulders. He was there, standing in the doorway, a silhouette against the cold blue light of the hall. He wasn't looking at her, but at the fireplace. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "The curse is stronger at night," he said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't turn. "It feeds on the darkness. It tries to reclaim any ground it has lost." She could see it now. The thin layer of frost on the stone floor was thicker near the door where he stood, creeping towards the center of the room where her bed was. Her presence created a small, invisible island of lessened cold, and the curse was the sea, constantly trying to wash over it. "Does it hurt?" she asked, her voice small. He finally turned his head, his pale eyes finding hers in the gloom. "It is a constant ache, a pressure, like being crushed by a glacier from the inside out." For the first time, she saw past the Alpha King, past the beast. She saw a man in unending agony. Her heart ached for him, a feeling so sharp and unexpected it stole her breath. "Come closer," she said, the words leaving her before she could think. "To the fire." He looked at the empty black hearth. "There is no fire." "Here," she clarified, patting the furs on the bed beside her. "It's warmer here." He stood frozen for a long moment, his expression unreadable. She thought he would refuse, that he would retreat back into his shadows. But then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he walked into the room. He didn't get into the bed, but sat on the edge, his back to her, a few feet away. Even that small proximity made a difference. The oppressive cold in the room seemed to lift, the pressure lessening. She could breathe easier. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sound was the faint whisper of the wind against the castle's frozen windows. "Tell me about the sun," he said suddenly, his voice rough with disuse. She blinked. "The sun? I remember it," he murmured. "But as a dream, a story I was told. Tell me what it feels like." And so, she did. She described the warmth on your skin on the first day of spring, the way it made the fields smell of damp earth and new life. She described the lazy heat of a midsummer afternoon, the way the light dappled through the leaves of a tree, the feeling of sun-baked stone under your palms. She spoke for hours, her voice soft in the stillness of the room. He didn't move, didn't speak, just listened. She felt his attention like a physical touch. As she spoke, she realized she wasn't just describing the sun for him. She was remembering what it was to feel alive, to feel warmth, to feel hope. When the first hints of gray light touched the sky, he stood. "Thank you," he said, the two words carrying an impossible weight. He looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the harsh lines of his face softened. The pale glow in his eyes seemed less like a curse and more like captured starlight. Then he was gone, and the room was a little colder for his absence. That night became a ritual. He would appear in her doorway as the deepest cold of the night set in, a silent guardian against the encroaching frost. He would sit on the edge of her bed, and she would talk. She told him the stories she'd read from his library. She told him about her village, about the simple, small joys she had managed to find in her broken life. She was talking to fill the silence, but she was also talking to see the subtle shifts in his expression, the minute ways he reacted. She was learning to read him, to see the flicker of interest in his eyes, the slight softening of his mouth. One night she was telling him a story about a mischievous sun spirit from one of the old books. She was gesturing with her hands, caught up in the tale, when her fingers brushed against the back of his hand. A jolt went through both of them. His skin was like ice, a cold so deep it felt like it burned. He flinched back as if struck, pulling his hand away. The air in the room crackled with a sudden tension. "Don't," he growled, his voice harsh. The rejection was a physical blow. She pulled her hand back, her cheeks flushing with shame. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "It is not you." He cut her off, his voice tight. "The curse. It reacts to contact. It surges. It is dangerous." He stood and paced the room, a caged predator. "You do not understand, Alara. This cold is not passive. It is sentient. It hates warmth. It hates life. Most of all, it hates hope. Your presence here gives me hope, and the curse is fighting back." He gestured to the window. She looked and saw that the frost on the pane was thicker than before, forming intricate, aggressive patterns like thorny vines. "It's getting stronger," she whispered. "It is feeding," he corrected, "on the hope you've brought into this castle. The more I am near you, the harder it fights to reclaim me, to freeze me solid from the inside out." The truth of their arrangement was suddenly, brutally clear. Her presence was both the cure and the poison. It held the curse at bay, but it also provoked it. By easing his suffering, she was making his enemy stronger. A voice, thin and cruel as a shard of ice, whispered in the back of her mind. "He is using you, little ember. He is using your warmth to fight his battle, and when you are extinguished, he will cast you aside." Alara gasped, looking around the room. There was no one there. "What is it?" Kalen demanded, his head snapping up. "I heard a voice," she stammered. His face went rigid, the blood draining from it until it was the color of bleached bone. "Morwen," he breathed, "the witch. She feels you now. She knows her curse is threatened." The whispers started after that. They came when she was alone, slithering into her thoughts. They preyed on her deepest insecurities, the ones she had carried since childhood. "You are a crutch for a dying king, nothing more. Look at you. A cripple. Do you really think he could ever see you as anything but a tool? He will drain you of your fire, and then you will be as cold and empty as he is." Alara tried to ignore them, to bury herself in the books, but the words were insidious. They planted seeds of doubt that began to sprout in the fertile ground of her own worthlessness. She started to watch Kalen with suspicion. Was he just using her? Was the kindness in his eyes a lie? The castle itself seemed to be dying faster. The frost crept further down the corridors. A section of the west wing collapsed under the weight of the ice, the sound echoing through the halls like a death knell. Kalen grew more distant, his face a mask of constant, grinding pain. He stopped his nightly visits to her room, leaving her alone with the encroaching cold and the poisonous whispers of the witch. The separation was an agony she hadn't expected. She missed his presence, his quiet listening, the way his gaze made her feel seen. The castle felt emptier than ever before, and the cold was no longer just in the stone, but inside her. One afternoon she found him in the throne room. He was standing before the great frozen heartstone of the castle, a massive crystal that was supposed to pulse with the life of the kingdom. Now it was almost entirely opaque with ice, only a faint, struggling light visible deep within its core. He had his hand pressed against its surface, his head bowed. His shoulders were slumped, and for the first time, he looked not like a king, but like a man utterly defeated. "It's failing," he said without turning. The Heartstone is dying. When it freezes completely, the castle will fall, and the curse will consume me entirely. Let me help, she pleaded, taking a step towards him. No, he roared, whirling on her. His eyes were blazing with a desperate, furious light. Your help is killing me faster, don't you see? Every moment of relief you give me, every spark of warmth, it's like blood in the water for her. She doubles her assault. Loving you. It's going to kill me. The word hung in the air between them. Loving. He hadn't said caring for you. He hadn't said needing you. He had said loving you. He seemed to realize what he'd said, the fury draining from him, replaced by a raw, horrifying vulnerability. He looked at her, and his mask of cold control shattered completely. She saw it all. The centuries of loneliness, the agony of the curse, and the terrifying, burgeoning love he felt for her. A love that was quite literally a death sentence. I cannot love you, he whispered, the words a plea. I will not. But it was too late. He had spoken the truth, and the curse had heard. Kalen staggered, a hand flying to his chest. A gasp of pain ripped from his throat. He looked down, and Alara watched in horror as a filigree of frost spread across the front of his leather tunic, branching out from his heart like a frozen flower. Kalen! She screamed, rushing forward. He fell to his knees, his body convulsing. The frost spread with terrifying speed, encasing his arms, his legs, his throat. His breath came in ragged, white plumes. Run! He choked out, his voice already turning brittle. Alara, run. She will come for you now. But she couldn't move. She was paralyzed by the sight of him being consumed by the ice, the life literally freezing out of him. The man who had carried her from the altar, the king who had listened to her stories in the dead of night, was dying before her eyes. A cold laugh echoed through the throne room, sharp and clear. It didn't come from any one direction, but from everywhere at once. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, coalescing into a single form. A woman emerged from the darkness. She was tall and gaunt, her skin the color of a drowned corpse, her hair a tangled mass of black seaweed. Her eyes were chips of obsidian, burning with an ancient, malevolent hatred. It was Morwen. How touching, the witch hissed, her voice the sound of ice cracking. The last Sun King, frozen by the warmth of a broken toy. I couldn't have designed a more perfect end. She glided towards the kneeling frozen form of Kalen. He was almost completely encased in ice now, only his eyes still visible, fixed on Alara, pleading with her to flee. He is mine now, little ember. Morwen sneered, placing a skeletal hand on the ice covering Kalen's shoulder. And his kingdom will be my frozen playground. Alara finally found her voice. Leave him alone, she said, her voice shaking but firm. Morwen turned her dead eyes on Alara. Or what? You will limp at me? You are nothing. A spark. And I am the endless winter. I will simply snuff you out. The witch raised a hand, and the cold in the room intensified tenfold. The air grew so frigid it felt like shards of glass in Alara's lungs. The floor beneath her feet cracked with frost. She could feel the chill seeping into her, slowing her blood, numbing her limbs. This was it. This was the end. She would freeze here, beside the man The thought hit her with the force of a physical blow. She loved him. In the silent castle, in the shared darkness, in the stories and the quiet moments, she had fallen in love with the broken, frozen king. And Morwen was taking him from her. Something inside her broke. Not her bones, not her spirit, but a dam. A wall she hadn't even known was there, holding back a lifetime of pain, of being told she was worthless, of being discarded and broken. All of that pain, all of that grief, and all of this new, fierce, protective love ignited into a single, white-hot point of rage. No, she whispered. Morwen laughed. It is already done. I said no! Elara screamed, the word tearing from her throat raw and full of power. And the world exploded in light. It wasn't a flicker. It wasn't a candle. It was a sun. A torrent of pure, golden fire erupted from her, a wave of heat so intense that the very air shimmered. The frost on the floor vaporized in an instant. The thick ice encasing the pillars and walls vanished with a sound like 1,000 shattering glasses. The wave of heat slammed into Morwen. The witch shrieked, a sound of pure agony as the warmth touched her. Her form, born of cold and shadow, began to smoke and dissolve. She threw up her hands to shield herself, but the light was everywhere, burning away her darkness, unraveling the threads of her ancient spell. Elara felt the power surging through her, a wild, joyful river of flame. It was a part of her. It had always been a part of her. The whispers of the witch had been lies, but the words of Kaelin had been true. There was a fire inside her. She stumbled forward, her limp forgotten, her body suffused with a strength she had never known. She fell to her knees beside Kaelin's frozen form and pressed her hands against the ice covering his heart. You will not have him, she snarled, not at the witch, but at the curse itself. She poured all of her will, all of her love, all of her newfound fire into him. The ice sizzled and steamed under her palms. Cracks raced across its surface, glowing with golden light from within. With a final, explosive roar of sound and energy, the icy shell shattered, exploding outwards into a million glittering shards of harmless melting water. Kaelin slumped forward, free. Across the room, Morwen let out one last fading scream. The fire returns. It is not possible. Her form dissolved completely, leaving behind nothing but the lingering smell of ozone and the sea. The throne room was silent. The blue, cold light of the torches had been replaced by the warm golden glow radiating from Elara's own skin. The heartstone of the castle, now completely free of ice, pulsed with a strong, steady beat, its light filling the hall. Elara looked down at Kaelin, who was now cradled in her lap. His skin was no longer deathly pale, but had a flush of life to it. His chest rose and fell with a deep, even breath. His eyes fluttered open. The pale winter moon glow was gone. They were simply gray, dark and clear as a storm-swept sea. He looked up at her, his expression one of dazed wonder. He slowly lifted a hand, not to her face, but to his own chest, right over his heart. A look of profound shock crossed his features. I'm warm, he whispered, the words filled with a child's awe. He touched his own skin, his own face, as if discovering them for the first time. He was warm. Then his gaze lifted back to her. He saw the faint golden light that still clung to her, the power that radiated from her like a halo. He saw the strength in her eyes, the fierce protectiveness. He saw his savior. Elara, he breathed her name, and it was a prayer. She was crying, she realized. Tears of relief, of exhaustion, of overwhelming joy were streaming down her face. She cupped his cheek, her hand trembling. His skin was warm against hers, truly, wonderfully warm. I thought I'd lost you, she sobbed. He reached up and covered her hand with his own, his grip strong and sure. You saved me. No, she said, shaking her head, a watery smile breaking through the tears. We saved each other. He pulled her down to him, his mouth finding hers. The kiss was not cold, not hesitant. It was fire and life and centuries of longing released in a single moment. It was a promise. It was a beginning. In the heart of the dead castle, surrounded by the remnants of a broken curse, life had finally, impossibly, returned. Weeks later, the castle was unrecognizable. The sun, a stranger to these lands for centuries, now streamed through windows that were no longer frosted over. It fell upon stone floors that were no longer slick with ice, but were warmed by its rays. Life had returned with a vengeance. Green shoots pushed their way through the cracks in the courtyard stones. The petrified trees in the forest below were shedding their stone-gray bark, revealing the living wood beneath. A faint blush of green was visible on their branches. The land was healing. So were its people. From hidden valleys and deep caves where they had survived in a state of cold, suspended animation, Kalen's people began to emerge. They returned to the castle not with fear, but with reverence, their eyes wide as they took in the miracle of the thaw. They looked upon Alara with awe. They called her the Sun Queen, the Fire Heart, the Lady of the Thaw. They saw the power that shimmered around her, but they also saw the quiet kindness in her eyes. They saw the way their king looked at her, his gaze full of a love so profound it was a tangible thing. Alara herself felt transformed. The fire that had erupted from her had not vanished. It now lived inside her, a steady, warm presence. It had burned away the last vestiges of her self-doubt. It had healed the old break in her leg, leaving behind no pain, no limp, only a faint, silvery scar. She was no longer the broken girl from the forgotten village. She was whole. One morning, she stood with Kalen on a high balcony, looking out over their healing kingdom. A warm breeze, the first in generations, ruffled her hair. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. His chin rested on her shoulder, and his warmth was a constant, comforting presence at her back. "Do you ever miss the silence?" she asked softly. The castle was no longer silent. It was filled with the sounds of life, the murmur of voices in the courtyard, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the laughter of children who had never known a world without cold. "Never," he rumbled, his voice close to her ear. The silence was a prison. "This," he squeezed her gently, "is freedom." She leaned back into him, her heart full. She thought of the village that had cast her out, of the altar where they had left her to die. It felt like a lifetime ago, a story about someone else. They had given her to the beast as a sacrifice, hoping to appease the darkness. They never could have imagined that they were actually sending the dawn. "I still find it hard to believe," she murmured, "that all that power was inside me, hidden away." "I believed it," Kalen said, his voice absolute. "From the moment I saw you. I didn't see a sacrifice. I saw the sun, and I had been in the dark for so long that I couldn't look away." He turned her in his arms, his gray eyes searching hers. The harsh lines of his face were gone, softened by happiness, by love. He was no longer the beast, no longer the frozen king. He was just Kalen, and he was hers. "They gave you to a monster, Alara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "but they didn't know the monster had been waiting his entire life for a queen." He kissed her then, a slow, deep kiss filled with the promise of 1,000 warm sunrises to come. And as the sun climbed higher, bathing their new world in golden light, Alara knew she was finally, truly, home. The cold was just a memory, and before them stretched an endless summer,